And then talk again a little bit about, you mentioned earlier the Shalia, this business of agency. I think Christians have lost sight of that a lot, and the power of that thought. When you're talking about this sense of Jesus Christ being God's unique and special agent, what are we saying here?
Yes, the Hebrew word is shaliach. It really means just one sent. The Hebrew word shalach is to send, and shaliach is just a participle in the passive form there, to be sent, one who is sent out, an ambassador. It's a very nice idea that God has used his own creation to work for him. I mean, that's reasonable. If you create an angel, why not use that angel? And so you have this famous text in Exodus 23, I think it is in Exodus 23, where he says, you better listen to my angel. My name, my authority is vested in that angel. You're not going to deal with me personally, but I'm sending my angel. You listen to him, you're listening to me. It doesn't matter whether you're listening to the angel or me, you're getting me through that angel. I love that. Similarly then with Moses, Moses is told to go and be God, Elohim. You go out and be God to Pharaoh. Doesn't mean you are God, but you are God. Can we handle that? Let's do it this way. In the classroom, we have done this for years. We say, okay, Dan sends me out on a job. I am Dan, but I'm not Dan. Can you handle that? That's beautiful, isn't it? People see that immediately. That's easily confused, isn't it? They might say, well, you're Dan. Okay, well, so you and Dan are the same person. Is that it? No, that's not what I'm saying. I am Dan, and yet I'm not Dan. Now, you figure that out. It's the agency principle. That is the key to this whole thing. It's very easily confused if you haven't got on that Hebrew wavelength of the shaliach principle. But fortunately, books are being written by top scholars on this subject now. So it's all being broken open. Thank goodness. It's about time.
Wonderful. We can breathe a little bit here. I think it's interesting to me then, one who sends another, by the very thought here, is greater than the one who is sent. The one who sends another has the greater sense of authority and ability to direct, but he may vest in the one he sends ones he sends, varied degrees of authority, various degrees of capacity to act on the sender's behalf.
That's right.
So, so many were sent in the scriptures by God, empowered, authorized to do various things. None so great as this unique human Son of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate Shalia.
Of course,
Jesus Christ. And so Jesus then does wonderful, amazing things that God has empowered him, authorized him to do. Very unique, very wonderful. But you should never confuse the Shalia with the one who sent and authorized his activities. In they're not one for one the same being at all.
No.
And so, so then Jesus, we have these cases then of Jesus forgiving sins. And people say, oh, he must be God. In fact, his enemies, we somehow love to build our theology around what the enemies of Jesus had to say.
That's great.
But that's terrible. But his enemies said, oh, no one can forgive sins but God alone. And but Jesus did forgive sins. This was in his capacity, was it not, as a Shalia,
of course,
one uniquely sent by God. And Jesus himself then says in that same setting, he says, "Don't you realize that the Son of Man has power to forgive sins upon earth? He's been given power." And then the crowd rightly recognizes that, oh my goodness, look what God has done. God has given such authority that this man, at least, can forgive the sins of others. It was unique. He was going to be the one who would die for the sins of others, that God was going to accept. And so he had a unique station with God as a unique Shalia, did many wonderful things that others did not do.
And we note that the public there did much better than the very legalistic theologians.
Yes, that's
the
right.
Angry one. The public had the common sense to see what amazing power is being invested in this human being.
Yeah, they wonder.
And the scholars got it wrong.
That's
see?
right.
The public's instinct was right there, and it often is so. Just reading the plain text, it was easy for them.
So the public goes away glorifying God, who has given such authority to this man in particular. That's amazing
We've
stuff.
got very good material in Greg Dyble's book, another book. I mentioned Greg Dyble from Australia wrote a book called "They Didn't Teach Me This in Church." The front cover is interesting because the preacher is holding up a Bible and behind his back are pages of the Bible torn out. They're not getting mentioned. It's a humorous approach, very nicely written. But he's got a special appendix on the Shaliach principle. I mean, there's so many examples of that, where the mother of James and John, in one account, she goes and says to Jesus, I'd like my children to be in prime positions in the kingdom, right? And the other account says they went. Well, who went? And people will argue about that. It doesn't matter whether you say the mother did it or whether she dispatched the children to do it. In Hebrew thinking, corporate thinking, they're acting as one. Doesn't mean they're the same person.
Right.
Nobody thinks the mother is the son.
Right.
But you see, the potential for confusion here is considerable.
And in the case of God, it doesn't have to be this ridiculous discussion about different people having God's substance or being the same substance. There's only one God. He is only one, and he is substantially only one.
Yes,
and but he's able to authorize men.
That's right.
And he does throughout the scriptures.
Right.
Doesn't make, he authorized Moses. Moses was certainly a Shaliach of God. He authorized him in amazing ways to speak for him, to speak for God.
Uniquely.
But that didn't mean that Moses was of one substance with God, because when we begin to look at the scriptures, obviously the scriptures are saying Moses was this man.
Of course.
Well, Jesus Christ, 1 Timothy 2:5 that you mentioned earlier,
the man,
the man Christ Jesus.
Right.
And wow,
in
authorized.
Acts 17 is marvelous. That God, this is a wonderful summary statement by Paul in Acts 17, that God has appointed a day, and he's commanding everyone everywhere to repent now, because he's fixed a day on the calendar when he's going to judge and administer the world by a son who is a man. And what's more, he's raised him from the dead to prove he's going to do it. That's Christianity, right there.
Beautiful, isn't it?
That's beautiful stuff.
And actually, all of the post-biblical ideas about Christ, making him into something other than a man, upsets that entire apple cart.
Absolutely.
It destroys the entire plan. God's plan was, and again, I would encourage all of our viewers to just go to Romans 5.
Yes.
Just read the whole chapter and let it say what it says. This whole business of salvation is about God choosing to bring hope and life and righteousness by a man. Now, a unique man by all means, but still truly a man.
Truly human. Yeah. Originating as a man. It's the origin that's so important. The genesis of Jesus in Matthew 1:18 is critically important.
You you were mentioning this word a little while ago, and I thought, before we get beyond it too far, but the word Elohim has been made much of.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yes, the word Elohim, although in scholarship now is quite clear, the fact that it has a plural ending doesn't mean that its meaning is plural. Now, that might be confusing. We have an S on the word news. We don't say the news are good. We use that as a singular. So language has its interesting characteristics. Scholars have documented all this nicely in the lexicons. It's very easy to show that the god Chemosh or the god Milcham, these pagan gods, are also called Elohim. They're not plural. They're single individuals. Moses is said to be God, Elohim. Well, Moses was not plural. The Messiah is actually called God once in Psalm 45. Thy throne, O God, is a reference to Messiah there. It's quoted in Hebrews 1:8. Clearly, Messiah is not a plural person.
And so again, the word is Elohim.
The word is Elohim.
One entity, one individual. Yeah.
So it's a language trick, but unfortunately people with rather little training in language, and I don't blame them for that, are easily caught by the idea that if it has a plural ending on it, it must be plural. All right, if that's so, then you're going to have to translate that in the beginning, gods.
Yes.
Because if we're talking about a grammatical plural, then in English that's gods.
Right.
So one has to invent a mystical grammatical category. This is a plural ending, but we're still going to say God. That in itself is confusing. It's quite unnecessary. Yeah, it's clear in the lexicons, by the way. The lexicons, there are 4 or 5 standard Hebrew lexicons. And the good commentators, I'm quoting now from the Genesis commentary in the Word Biblical series, and the author there says it's universally accepted now that the let us make man, or the plural ending of Elohim, is nothing to do with the Trinity.
That's right.
Words to that effect. I wish we could just let the Academy speak clearly, because people on the internet waste an awful lot of time with their Strong's Concordances, struggling, ransacking the text to find just the one verse that will overthrow the evident evidence of everything else.
I guess
waste of time.
Their determination springs eternal.
It does.
Somehow or another they're going to. But it doesn't work.
It doesn't
never
work. They're defending what they think is orthodoxy. Relax. When you've got 4 us texts in the Bible, 4 of them, which are supposed to demonstrate that God is 3, and you've got thousands upon thousands of I, me, thou, thee, he, him texts. Thousands.
Yeah.
It's extremely inconsistent to make those 4 erode the evidence of all those others. After all, the text never says there's one God, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It does say there's one God, the Father, and the word God in the New Testament occurs 1,300 plus times. It means the Father almost always. There are 1 or 2 disputed verses we might get to later, where people have thought that Jesus is being called God, where it's so uncertain that even scholars can't agree. Well, that's a terrible way to construct the creed.
Well, one thing I learned a long time ago was when you've got something that comes along and there's a cloud over that particular verse, or it's doubtful, side, and then go on to the ones where you can be clear and certain about what they're saying.
That's exactly right.
And then come back and take a look at it later. But don't drive a stake in and put all your energy, effort.
That's right.
Don't stake all your hopes on a verse where there's a question to begin with.
Where there's a cloud, I like that. Where there's a cloud, there's a manuscript difference, there's a grammatical, syntactical difference that even scholars cannot determine. Then there's no business the ordinary Bible reader trying to build his creed on something that even a highly specialized grammar expert disagrees on. That's absurd. What sort of a God would reveal himself in that way? That's just.
I'm always fascinated with some of these passages, like Genesis 1:26, let us, and then using the word Elohim. I would say abusing that word sincerely, but no one in the Bible ever makes those points out of those things. You can read the entire Bible, and no one is saying, "Oh, didn't you see where it said let us make man?" No one's making that point in the way that these folks would like to make it.
But they did in the 2nd century.
By the time we get up into the
rot, you see, is beginning. They're beginning to do this Trinitarian exercise, not the whole thing flat out, but they're beginning to go in the wrong direction, as from earlier than 150. But I quoted the one in 150 because it's so blatantly bent out of shape to suggest that Jesus was engineering his own generation.
Well, and then the same thing about the word Elohim. No one in all the Bible makes that point. Here, the word Elohim is occurring untold numbers of times, and no writer in the New Testament says, "Oh, look, there's the word Elohim. That included Jesus and this multiplicity of persons." No. Not so.
Well,
there was only one who is God.
That's right.
And Jesus identifies him clearly.
Yes.
You, Father, you are the only one who truly is God.
Of course.
And but it's interesting. But we begin to find these little turns and twists in post-biblical times. Saying, they really meant multiple beings as God. No one in the Bible ever heard that idea. No one in the Bible ever said that idea.
And look what they could have done with the Greek. The Greek word theos is singular for God. So it translates Elohim. When you've got an Elohim in the Hebrew, they ought to come in with thei, gods. You do find gods, in Psalm 82:6, and Jesus' quotation of that in John 10. You do find the Greek plural, thei, gods. I'm using the modern Greek pronunciation, by the way. That's the way we teach it at Atlanta Bible College. But nobody calls theos Elohim. I mean, nobody says that the Elohim is to be translated as plural. It's not. It's theos. It's one God. Singular. This isn't so hard.
Well, it really isn't. In fact, once this begins to come, the thing that's hard is the traditional views that developed and trying to make the Bible somehow say what those traditional views later said after Bible times. It's a terrible burden, isn't it? It must be a terrible burden for folks to try to make that work.
It's an equal struggle. Relax, take it easy. It's not that hard.
That's right. You mentioned actually, I guess it's John 10:33.
Yeah.
And you have in there where that we have again the enemies of Jesus, greatest theologians on earth. We always quote his enemies. We'd rather quote him than him. We don't know why he even said some things he said according to these some folks. But those enemies, now they had it. But here you have this case where Jesus has said, "I and my Father are one." We understand that's not very hard, and a lot of good, scholars and so on recognize this is not a statement about it. But there's so many folks say, "Oh, that means that he is one
in essence."
This strange thing. But then Jesus, they make the Jewish critics of that moment come against him and say, well, you're being a man. You're making yourself God. Terribly. But Jesus, once and for all, sets this issue straight, doesn't he, about who he really said he was.
Yes, of course.
That very passage.
Yes, and using the Psalms, using the Old Testament to prove the point. Simply saying that if God could address judges in the Old Testament time as God, as gods, if you like, in fact, gods in the Greek, plural, why couldn't he then call his unique son, Son of God, which he does? So he then goes on record to say who he really is. He's the Son of God.
The Son of God.
He puts the record.
He never said he was God.
No.
He indeed identified himself clearly.
Right.
I said I am the Son of God.
And if you want to say I'm God, you're right. Flat out right. You know, I am Yahweh, I am God. All he has to do is say it. He never, ever said it. When challenged along that line in the other passage in John 5, he immediately says, I can do nothing by myself. Yeah. Well, what kind of a depotentiated God is that? Who has to wait for another God to tell him what to do? Yes. The whole thing's absurd. That in John 10:30, where you mentioned I and the Father are one, I mean, the easy solution to that is in John 17, verse 11, where he says the disciples are to be one. Yes. The neuter of the Greek there, en, not is, not one person, but to be one thing. The disciples are to be one in the same way as the Father and the Son are one. Clearly that would make the disciples God. I mean, the whole argument has failed years ago, by the way, and no sophisticated scholar will use that argument anymore in John 10:30.
Yeah. Amazing. And here we are. What are we doing here? We're not just wanting to argue with folks about stuff.
Oh, no.
I mean, there's a lot more fun things to do, I think, than argue, though arguing is not necessarily wrong if it's done in a good heart and good spirit. But that's not our purpose. Our purpose is we are rejoicing in the truth about the real Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible, the Jesus of the Scriptures, the Jesus that Paul really knew, and we're rejoicing in that, and we're glorifying God for his true human Son, Jesus Christ, unique among all humanity, chosen by God to truly be the representative of the rest of us, to pave the way, to open the way into the kingdom of God. He is, in fact, the Lord of that kingdom and the Lord of his people now. And we're celebrating that Jesus is the Son of God, the human Son of God.
Right.
And we're just a bit incensed at times at people who say, oh, that's not good enough. He had to be God.
Yes.
No, it was quite good enough for him to be the true human Son of God.
Yes.
God loved him. God was pleased with him. He grew in favor with God and men, according to Luke. So I think we're celebrating something.
I think so.
And I think as long as this tradition keeps a hold on people as it has, and then we're not going to be able to celebrate this true human Jesus Christ. And we say, oh, you're taking something away from him when you say he's human. Not so. He is uniquely God's human Son. We recognize that. Truly begotten in a virgin and born in this life, but truly God's Son. God truly was his Father. But when the problem to me becomes, I want to rise up and defend that human Jesus. We're not degrading him. They're degrading him when they say, oh, a human Jesus isn't good enough. Right. A human Jesus could not die for humanity. Right. A human Jesus could never do these things. So he had to be some super being of some kind. All we're doing is we're saying, wait a minute. Whoop, stop the play. Because this human Jesus, truly one of us, truly God's only begotten human Son, he's good enough. And that's our message, and that's what we're celebrating.
Right. And the Father's very proud of that.
Oh yes, he is.
Slap in the face of the Father, say your son isn't good enough.
Oh, your human son. Oh, he doesn't. But God doesn't quite have a human son. We got to get into that sometime. God, we like to do away with those words, only begotten Son. And as you say, it doesn't imply at all sexual interaction between. But it is a miracle of God, and God truly was his Father. Now, why isn't that good enough?
It should be.
Why isn't it good enough?
It's clarifying.
I love that real Jesus. I love that true Jesus.
He makes sense of the Bible, too.
He does, doesn't he?
Oh, perfect sense.
And loves his Father unswervingly. You're the only true God, he says. Well, I'm just agreeing with Jesus.
That's right.
Yeah.
Relax you, put years on your life.
Put years on your life.
Not to have to struggle so manfully with all of these texts, that you ransack the text for.
That's right.